Let a Vietnamese speak again about his country's troubles and efforts. Nguyen Ngoc Linh is the director of the Vietnamese press.
I'm going to say that we have many, many problems. Some of them look quite insoluble. Nonetheless, we do not lose heart. We are still striving, and we are striving every day in order to solve all of these and bring a new society to Vietnam. And in all of these efforts of ours at saving our nation from communism and also at the same time building a new society for Vietnam, we are getting much help from many friendly nations and allies. As a matter of fact, we have help from 40 nations, among which one of the foremost nations is the Australian nation and people. And I'd like to mention the appreciation of the entire Vietnamese people for all the help that we are getting from Australia in the field of medical assistance, in the field of education, and of course, last but not least, your Australian fighters, the valiant ones that are fighting alongside with us in Vietnam have been absolutely marvelous, and they have taught us many things in anti-guerrilla warfare.
The people of South Vietnam face the problems that beset any developing country of Asia.
But the company, we are in the hotel business, in the travel agency business. We are the exclusive dealer for Ford in the country, Ford cars. Oh, many, many other things, like an oil company in the forming. We have a bottling company. In other words, we greatly believe in the future of this country, and we think there's a great future for Vietnam, and we think that Vietnam will be livable, will not go communist, because otherwise all these companies will go to waste. And the way we work is we take a calculated risk. If we don't lose South Vietnam within the next 3 to 5 years, then nobody can catch up with us. I'm a Johnny-come-lately as far as war profiteering is concerned. The reason why I organized this group of companies is because when I was in Paris, I saw that peace was coming whether we liked it or not. Therefore, I got home in order to prepare for peace. All these companies have been organized in order to prepare for peace and prepare for the economic takeoff that will come with peace. Like we have the infrastructure of hotels, of travel agencies and things like that, but of course there are no tourists in Vietnam now, but there will be. And we are getting ready for that sort of thing.
Ladies and gentlemen, since the fall of Saigon, I have had 35 years to think about what went wrong. Even before that fateful April 1975, I had had 10 years of government service to witness from a front row seat many of the mistakes that American and Vietnamese leaders responsible for managing the war made in Vietnam. This afternoon, I'm not going to delve into the why and how of America's intervention into the Vietnam conflict. I am just going to offer my thinking about the lessons that can be learned from America's Vietnam experience. From the very beginning of America's commitment in Vietnam, there was a huge gap of understanding between Americans and Vietnamese of all stripes, a cultural gap that led from one misunderstanding to another about each other's intentions, goodwill, expectations, and much else. Indeed, the Americans, with their gung-ho, can-do, task-oriented attitude, have the tendency to take control of their partnership with the Vietnamese, even at the risk of stepping on our toes. On the other hand, the Vietnamese, proud of their Confucian traditions and steeped in a millennial historical consciousness, resented the pushy attitude of many American advisors, and the condescendence of American commanding generals caused them to resist or even ignore the recommendations of our allies. A big factor that was overlooked was an effective information propaganda campaign by the American side. Such a campaign never happened because the Americans did not even suspect that such a campaign was necessary. Another thing American officials should have done was to react ferociously to fallacious and misleading news reports in the American media. Instead, the U.S. kept silent, saying and doing nothing of consequence. South Vietnam cannot bear responsibility for this because starting from the late 60s, the South Vietnamese ambassador to the U.S. could not appear at a college campus without being subjected to an avalanche of abuse. The said information campaign should have been aimed at multiple audiences, namely the Vietnamese people, the American people, the U.S. military, the South Vietnamese military, and the world at large. Before being sent to Vietnam, American officials and troops should also be familiarized with various aspects of Vietnamese culture and way of life. The understanding gap mentioned above led to fateful decisions on the American side, such as encouraging the Vietnamese generals to stage a coup against President Ngo Dinh Diem and his brother advisor, which ended tragically in their death. This, in my estimation, marked the beginning of the end of South Vietnam in its fight against the invaders from the north. Once President Johnson decided to send combat troops to help South Vietnam, the American generals quickly took charge of the war. They fought a conventional war against communist insurgents who at first only fought the only way Vietnamese knew how against a superior enemy. That is, they fought as guerrillas, disappearing only to reappear when the superior force moves on. The fact that the war was often directed from the White House only added another layer of intervention which tied the hands of the generals in the field. While the communist invaders and the local Viet Cong insurgents could roam all over the South, the American and South Vietnamese sides were not allowed to go north to bring the war to where it hurts. For a long time, they were not even allowed to go into Cambodia, where the North Vietnamese withdrew whenever they needed rest and recuperation. In other words, the American generals were given the responsibility of fighting the war, but they were not allowed to win, only to repel attacks when and if they come. Even after President Nixon went to China and met with Mao Zedong, the Americans were still leery of Chinese intervention should our side take the fight to North Vietnam. Thanks to documents recently declassified, Calvin Woodward of the Associated Press wrote an article on May 29, the year 2006, in which he quoted Henry Kissinger, then National Security Advisor, telling Prime Minister Zhou Enlai something to the effect of, open quotes, "In my view, after peace is restored, the political orientation of what comes after is of no concern to the U.S., end of quote. And that, open quote, if we can live with the communist government in China, we ought to be able to accept it in Indochina, end of quote. This practically amounts to giving assurance that the United States would not engage in Vietnam after a communist victory. At the height of its engagement, the U.S. had 500,000 troops in Vietnam. It had been suggested that had the Americans deployed these men on our side of the 17th parallel from the Ben Hai River all the way into Laos, and had the American Navy mine the port of Haiphong, interdicting all sea traffic in bringing war supplies to the communists, they could have choked off the Ho Chi Minh Trail to the invaders from the north. leaving it to the South Vietnamese armed forces to take care of the guerrilla insurgents in the South, something we could have handled without much difficulty. In fact, the Ho Chi Minh Trail could have been cut off with far less than the 500,000 troops I mentioned above. In a study that General Bruce Palmer, or is it David Palmer, did at the time, he even suggested that 60,000 troops could have done the job. The government of Thailand also suggested more or less the same strategy, using a multinational force composed of American, Thai, Laotian, and Vietnamese troops. With such a strategy, the U.S. would not have lost more than 58,000 killed in action, an untold number of wounded, and the anti-war movement would never have had enough wind in their sail to keep up their opposition to the war and to pressure Congress to cut off all all assistance to the South, leaving it defenseless against the North Vietnamese invaders. The greatest irony of the Vietnam War was when, tired of the conflict, President Nixon thought of Vietnamization as a way to put the whole burden on the South Vietnamese army. The word Vietnamization implies that during the entire 10 years of massive American intervention, the only ones fighting were the Americans, while the million or so Vietnamese troops and militia were sitting on their behinds watching the show. Nothing could be further from the truth. While American bravery in places such as Khe Sanh, essentially a diversionary battle, was glorified in the American press, untold battles fought and won in places like An Loc, Quang Tri, and many other locations by the South Vietnamese armed forces were ignored by the American press, some of whom even had the temerity to call our heroic fighters rabbits, predicting as early as 1968 that the end was near, despite the fact that the communists suffered 40,000 casualties, or half of the attacking force, in the Tet Offensive of 1968. I still cannot understand how American media gurus such as Walter Cronkite could interpret a colossal communist defeat as a communist victory. Rabbits, indeed, those Vietnamese troops who suffered nearly 500,000 casualties while fighting to defend South Vietnam, and who, by some calculation, killed 4 times as many communist lions. Vietnamization of the war should have been in place, or rather should have been left alone from the very beginning of the American intervention. But because they took over the direction of the war, our American allies stripped us of our just cause as we fought against the aggressors, and by the same token, they also helped to reinforce the communist claim of being patriots defending the motherland against the American imperialists, and to accuse us of being American puppets. American journalists were free to roam all over the country, interview anyone they pleased, film and televise all the most shocking horrors of the war. Thus, for the first time in the history of the American media, the war was brought into American living rooms every evening and contributed to persuading the American public of the extreme cost of a war fought 10,000 miles from home, wasting American lives and taxpayers' dollars. As far as the Vietnamese side was concerned, we also made monumental mistakes. With the encouragement of even the blessing of the highest-ranking American officials, our politically immature, top-ranking generals staged a coup against a democratically elected president and murdered both him and his brothers, Nhu and Con. Yet after seizing power, the generals were incapable of governing the country, and tried coup and counter-coups against one another, thus sapping whatever energy there remained in the country to fight the Viet Cong. When the communists started their final push against South Vietnam, President Thieu, who, inspired by his American counterparts, also managed the war from Independence Palace, ordered the army to pull out of the 1st and 2nd Army Corps in such a hurry and without any planning whatsoever that panic set in and the various highways leading south were clogged with tens of thousands of refugees and evacuating troops, and under constant communist attack became highways of death. This tragic mistake accelerated the takeover of South Vietnam by the communists, who were only wishfully thinking of victory, and their Politburo only made tentative plans to take over the South by 1976 at the earliest. The South Vietnam government and its information arm did a heroic effort to counter the anti-war movement in the United States, but were not effective against a movement supported by the entire communist world with the backing of both the Soviet Union and Red China. In terms of lobbying, our diplomatic representatives in the U.S. were too busy trying to read the intentions of the American government and the Congress, and did not spend enough time cultivating meaningful public relations efforts aimed at the American public at large. Furthermore, as Ambassador Bui Diem found out, even if there was any kind of debate with the anti-war crowd, our people would have been too polite, and debate usually degenerated into psychological theater of sarcasm and vitriolic accusations. Debate such as it was became an alley fight and demanded the psychological and rhetorical skills and aggressiveness for this kind of fight. Truth was no longer important. Even U.S. government people could not debate because they were too civilized when facing crowds that parade in the streets of America's capital the flag of the Viet Cong enemy, who was killing and maiming our boys every day. During their demonstrations, they even shouted in unison, "Ho, ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh." Imagine anyone shouting Heil Hitler at rallies in Washington during World War II. He would most likely be lynched or shot on the spot. Inside South Vietnam, our information agencies were not effective in countering the communist propaganda machine, which was quite persuasive when combined with long daggers at night and death threats against the defenseless South Vietnamese population in the countryside. From 1965 to 1972, as the head of the National Broadcasting System, then President of Vietnam Press, spokesman for the Prime Minister, then Director General of Information and Propaganda, concurrently member of the Cabinet, then press officer for the South Vietnam delegation to the Paris Peace Talks, I do bear a share of responsibility for not having done my best to convince President Thieu and the government to send our best and brightest to the U.S. to confront the anti-war movement and spread the good word about South Vietnam's effort to try and stop the advance of communism into the countries of Southeast Asia. Later, overseas information offices were opened in Paris, London, Tokyo, and Washington. But they came too late to make a difference. It is my wish that from the lessons learned from the Vietnam War, today's American leaders will be more effective in dealing with the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan and the other hotspots of the world. It is in this spirit that I offer my thoughts about why we lost in Vietnam.